Okay, I think everybody's back. Dr. Thompson will be happy to entertain questions, and Shart and I will run around with the mics and get the mics to you, so we won't have to repeat the questions. Okay? Go ahead, Shart.
I'm going to throw several questions at you, and you can pick the one you want to answer. I'm over here. One is, it sounded as though there was a rather trickle-down explanation that you were making regarding the technological progress that the income in the hands of the wealthy was producing this. What role would the baby boom play? You have a disproportionate older population. They tend to have in their pockets lifetime earnings, and they are the ones demanding those services. Isn't that as likely an explanatory for increasing the demand on those lower income workers? Combine that with the push through from the 90s on to create a contingency workforce with the attack on trade labor unions and the movement of many industries to remove fringe benefit packages, but actually increase wages for people as independent contractors, but contingency workers. Those are just two things that strike me, and there are others, but I mean, I'm trying to think beyond the social causes that you chose to highlight and think about other kinds of social parameters and drivers that might be producing these income shifts that you're talking about.
And I think that's great, because by raising those issues, I was trying to think beyond the usual issues as well. So I think that's good that you're doing that. I would distinguish myself from trickle-down economics in the sense that, at least as I understand it from the past and how it's being advocated now, I think the idea is that trickle-down, reducing regulation, taxes on the most affluent and the people who control capital and business will raise up everyone, where I was more focused on a particular segment of the workforce. So I don't know that, I think it's fair to describe that as trickled economics. When you said it, I hope I smiled. I was smiling inside. I thought that was a good point. But I do think it's a little different than how the term's been used in some cases. I do think the world's been changing, and maybe contingent work is an aspect of this technological change. I guess economists as a group, perhaps to a fault, don't like to pick prices. And so if that's where the economy is taking, wages are a price, if that's where the economy is taking wages, I agree that that's probably one of the processes by which inequality is growing worse. But I don't know if changing those practices, it perhaps could address some of the inequality, but also if you set prices, at least I think economists believe, that could end up raising sort of the overall standard of living as well. So in other words, we do want to reduce inequality, but we want to reduce it. We should be cognizant, if we're reducing it in a way that that there's a trade-off with the overall standard of living, and we need to think carefully about that, which is why I tended to gravitate in the talk towards solutions that would both reduce the inequality and raise the standard of living by helping more workers cope with more families cope with social change. At least that's what I thought I was doing. Those are good
With
questions.
incredible respect for my dear friend David Iaquinta, would you please come up with one question that's concise, so we can get around the room?
No, I would love more questions like that. That was a great question.
Yes, you may have answered this already just now, but the speaker last week talked about the Gini index and that it was headed basically in the wrong direction in terms of more income inequality. And how would you explain that, as I understand it, with the rise in median income in Nebraska and nationwide versus the declining or rising Gini index?
I think that, and our speaker is here, so I think some of the trends in inequality that I saw with the 50th and 25th percentile would be consistent with the rising Gini coefficient. So I think, yeah, in other words, that would be, those trends would be part of that implicitly be part of that calculation of the Gini coefficient, and would be contributing to a rising Gini coefficient.
Yeah, I think the perspective that social causes are inhibiting the movement of people into higher paying jobs is really pretty interesting. One of the big social changes in the last 30 years or so has been the war on drugs and the rise in percentage of the American population in prison or labeled as felons, which is a lifelong economic liability. Has that risen to the point it actually is affecting your statistics?
That's an excellent point. I bet it is.
Back here. Okay.
I'll remember that in future presentations. Thank you.
I was just wondering, what has your research shown about wages and union jobs and non-union jobs?
I do think that the reduction in the unionization rate in the manufacturing sector, the private manufacturing sector, has contributed to the increase in inequality. However, again, it depends. It depends how you interpret those jobs. So, to the extent that the unions were organizations that help people be extremely productive workers, then the unions were both contributing to our standard of living and economic growth and fighting inequality. If, to an extent, the unions were simply using bargaining to change the price of labor, then there may have been a trade-off between inequality and our standard of living.
You quoted a statistic about workplace history, I think 59% for Lincoln, Nebraska. That kind of surprised me because when we brought Kawasaki Heavy Industries car line into Lincoln, Mr. Tamba, the chairman said that one of the reasons we were up against 9 other communities, one of the main reasons they came to Lincoln, Nebraska, and his quote was, "We have less brown bottle flu on Monday morning in Lincoln, Nebraska than any of our other factories." So can you, how solid a statistic was your 59% about workplace history?
Well, I guess one thing is, Kawasaki is sort of at the pinnacle of employers. So I would imagine they're going to get they're going to get an applicant pool where the mix of people is the strongest. There's obviously some of the existing work. Part of the reason that people are long-term workers at these factories is because they don't have these problems to as large a degree. So the concerns about the applicant pool aren't necessarily the whole set of workers. That was my answer to the question. The other thing is I have not done these surveys in other states, so it could be that the numbers would be even more challenging. I just haven't had occasion or resources to do that.
You mentioned 3 big sectors in Nebraska: agriculture, trucking, and insurance. How do those different sectors fit into the profile of percentile wage for those industries in Nebraska? And also, to what extent do they show jobs that reflect new technology that didn't exist maybe 30 years ago?
Well, agriculture is, of course, an avid user of technology. I was just talking with someone about this in the break. With agriculture, incomes are quite variable by year. Sometimes incomes aren't fully reflected in government statistics, and sometimes there's a lot of agricultural producers that are cash poor or have limited incomes but are still succeeding at wealth creation. Certainly there's a lot of very successful entrepreneurs in agriculture, and I would put them over towards the higher end of the distribution. There's also obviously people who are struggling. Insurance tends to be a high wage sector. Definitely using technology, just very knowledge intensive. And then manufacturing is more a middle wage sector, because of the decline in unionization and some of the other factors. It's now above the median wage, above the average wage, but not well above it. Although employers like Kawasaki are an example, or a counterexample. And then technology is critical in manufacturing, and the manufacturing workers who are able to work with technology are relatively succeeding in this environment. So I think our leading industries, to the extent that the upper parts of the distribution are growing still, some of our leading industries are contributing to that.
Yes, Dr. Thompson, you mentioned the trickle down. I can assure you that the trickle down does not help those people who raise all boats, and some of the boats are tied down with a short rope. So, yeah, it might work, Larry. But on the tax hearings recently, they talked about 90% of the businesses being owned by small businesses, and that they needed income tax breaks. And so they're trying to reduce the number of tax brackets and then justify the reduction of the taxes by almost 90% of the folks who in reality won't get any help to speak of anyway. Is it really beneficial to raise or lower income tax for the upper brackets and for those with money, and then have a regressive tax to have it replaced by those people who don't have money?
What were they planning on replacing it with? I can't answer. Sales tax? Well, yeah, I'm not sure about that as a plan. Now, are we talking about in Nebraska or national?
Well, given time, it'll be at national level also.
Because in Nebraska, we have a lot of people face. We have the top bracket that starts at a relatively low income, but then, most people are eligible for some type of exemption and so forth, so that raises the where the top bracket kicked in. But there's a significant share of the middle class even that does face that top bracket on their last dollar, their last few $1,000s at least. So it could be in Nebraska for that reason. It is accurate to say there would be some benefits for the middle class as well.
Well, if you reduce
I don't think it's a good idea to lower the income tax by raising the sales tax. Some will argue, economists will argue that, the income tax hurts growth and the standard of living by distorting people's economic decisions. But the sales tax distorts it almost as much. Maybe not quite as much. So just replacing the income tax with the sales tax, I don't think would be all that helpful for economic growth and would have the problems you talked about in terms of being regressive.
So you're not offering any solutions here yet?
I guess the things I've suggested in the past would be working on some of the exemptions within the sales tax and then lowering the sales tax rates. So if some of the exempted items include food, for example, medicine, some personal services. So if we did collect sales tax on that, obviously having some sort of mechanism for poor people to help refund them those additional sales tax that are due, then we could lower our overall sales tax rate, and that would help with efficiency. There's some ability to do that within the income tax. Again, get rid of the exemptions and lower the rates.
Well, one quick question then. On the corporate taxes, if the U.S. lowers their corporate tax rates, then do we also need to lower the income tax rates for those in that world?
Some economists will argue that corporate taxes are especially negative for the economy, with some merit. I'm always inclined to remind people that taxes on anyone is negative for the economy, including working people and middle-class people. And we should be quite careful in saying some are more important than others.
Can we expand on that idea that's been just presented and look at various policies, whether it's government policies, corporate policies, industry policies, or whatever, that seem to perpetuate the idea of an inequality? And I'll give you a good example. Your university, I was university for a lot of years. We often saw a percent raise for everybody.
Yes.
1% of a secretary's wage is nothing. Didn't even cover the increase in healthcare costs some years. 1% for faculty was huge. The system perpetuates this structure that we have.
That would lock in the existing inequality.
Right.
And increase it in an absolute sense, yes.
Any comments about that?
Any comment? Again, I think that's true. And obviously with a public institution, you're a little hesitant to talk about, well, something's the market wage, and that's the wage the market has chosen. But you'd be more comfortable with a private sector business probably. But again, if we try to pick the wages rather than let them be determined by the market, there could be trade-offs between reducing inequality and the standard of living and economic growth. Maybe we should do more of that. I mean, I'm not here to say we shouldn't. The real prize would be some way to help people be worth a higher wage and then both reduce the inequality and raise the overall standard of living.
Let me follow up.
Yes.
Because I've been involved with several hiring decisions where we found excellent people, okay? But the university system refused to allow us to pay them the wages which they deserve for that position. And then we couldn't find people to fill those positions at the wage level.
I've heard comments about that in state government as well.
That's a policy
Or
decision
parts of state
by the university that perpetuates, basically based on what they view as the worth of that particular job.
You said you were former university, right?
I unfortunately retired.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm current university. Yeah, I think, but let me generalize it. I think any big bureaucracy, especially a public bureaucracy, may have rules that can have effects like you talked about.
I've witnessed those very same things, disparities in federal government for going on now for 35 years. You can't pay people what they deserve. But my question, have you formed an opinion yet on the effect of the border tax on middle income people in Nebraska? That should be the tax paid for imported goods. Projection by notable people of one political party is that it will benefit the 1% significant, the top 10% income bracket significantly. It will help small businesses nationwide and perhaps grow that part of the economy, but clearly it's going to have a very deleterious effect on the middle class.
Well, it depends if you believe the economists and their models. So The,
What else would we depend on?
That's right. So the theory behind many of the major proponents of the border tax, they believe that when the tax goes in, the value of the US dollar will go up so much that the competitive position of imported goods will be unaffected. So in other words, the economist advocates of it don't think that it's going to be beneficial to working people. In other words, that it'll raise their relative competitive advantage. What they're interested in it for is it'll essentially reduce corporate taxes on business and high income. And I'm not trying to make this a high income, low income thing. It's reducing taxes on income and raising them on consumption. It's a step towards a national consumption tax because of a belief that consumption taxes are more economically efficient than income taxes. As I said earlier, they are somewhat more economically efficient, but it's not a night or day thing. They're somewhat more economically efficient. If the economic theory is right, I guess they could do it. If the economic theory is not right, if the value of the dollar doesn't rise enough, or if it overshoots, if it doesn't rise enough perfectly, then it could advantage working people over their competitors at factories in foreign countries, but then it'll raise the cost of stuff for everybody. If it overshoots, it could hurt working people relative to their competitors in factories in other nations. So I was excited about what they used to talk about with tax reform, which was closing the loopholes and lowering the rates, but that apparently is out of favor.
Can we go back to the data that you showed, that those high percentages of poor work histories?
Yes.
And I want to, it's sort of a comment, but I've seen enough HR bureaucracies in my working career to wonder about the variability of judgments on people's, what does poor work history mean? I mean, could it be, isn't it at least conceivable that in measuring this kind of data, you've got to account too for the subjective judgments of HR bureaucracies?
Yes.
And the opportunities to train somebody with a work history that maybe isn't the best?
Well, and actually I think another set of policies that would allow us to reduce inequality and raise the standard of living and economic growth would be to either help all, to the extent that those assessments of poor work history are accurate, they would probably be accurate at least in some cases. To the extent that they are, help all those people evolve over time into someone with a good work history so that people want to hire them and train them. Or maybe in the real cynical world, there's some people that are always going to have a bad work history. But take that portion of those folks and help them reestablish their good work history. Maybe they were a goofy, 22-year-old single person, and now they're ready to get serious, and that bad work history can be a great work history in 10 years. How do we identify those people and help them make that transition, I think, is a critical issue.
In Lincoln, Nebraska, about 50% of the kids who come to school are on free and reduced lunch. And that's families of four who get a salary of $22,000 or up to 50% more. And 10% of those families, of those 50%, are in abject poverty. What's the effect on the economy of the state? You pointed to the fact that some areas and some schools were not good and that affected the economy. What's the general effect of having 50% of the kids growing up in poverty or semi-poverty?
Well, again, if that is an environment that creates some of the stresses and issues that we talked about earlier, then it will have long-term effects on the workforce. I think some of the struggles, and you just saw 10 years worth of struggles, that I could have more than 10 years of data of that 25th percentile family. I mean, I think part of the reason you see those high numbers is some of those 25th percentile families that wouldn't have been on free and reduced lunch 30 years ago now are. So that's part of the difference. And I also just think that there's been some loosening of the rules over time, perhaps appropriately.
We know
but the measurement has changed somewhat.
We know that poverty and free and reduced lunch families have much higher dropout rates.
Sure.
Go to college much less well, and yet we're talking about getting a highly skilled workforce in Nebraska because we have little in the way of mineral resources, et cetera. So we have the quality of the workforce has to determine the quality of the economy. So what do you think could be done to alter that situation of generic poverty?
Well, I'm glad we're making sure that kids are not hungry at school. That would help. That hopefully does help. I think there needs to be, more support for students and families in that situation, whether that's, churches helping, more public programs to help low-income families. We do a lot. We're doing more with things like early care and education in Nebraska. I think more of that stuff, maybe more tutoring course for kids that are struggling in school. And there's kids struggling at every school, but make sure there's tutors, the needed number of tutors available at all the schools.
Lincoln, Nebraska, and Scottsbluff have historically had unemployment rates below what I was trained when I got my degree in economics in 1970s. That full employment was considered to be employment that had an unemployment level below 5%. And we have historically been at that level even throughout the recession. So the labor pool that's available for seeking new employment would be basically that unemployable 4%, would it not?
Well, I think, and this is one of my lessons I learned in Kentucky. I think that the full employment, thank you for using, I would say natural rate of unemployment, that's like econ jargon. Full employment makes way more sense.
Yeah, but 72
Yeah.
is different jargon.
Yeah, maybe clearer. So the full employment rate varies drastically by part of the country based on the quality of the workforce. So I think that our unemployment rate, which is almost always well below the U.S. average, does not mean there are fewer workers available here. It means our workers are of higher quality, which the gentleman from Kawasaki apparently also believed. And I think that's the correct way to interpret our low unemployment rate. It's an indicator of high workforce quality.
Yeah, it's hardly a comment and a question. I'll stand up. I've known a lot of workers at Kawasaki, and I don't know how many people are aware, probably a lot of you do, that a lot of their workforce is hired through these labor agencies, which after I retired, I worked for one myself for a period of time. I lived in Kansas City. And what they do is if you get on full time, you might get $20 an hour as a welder, but when you hire out through a labor agency, they pay $12, and then the labor agency gets the other $8. Yeah, you can comment on that if you want. But I want to also point out how the government uses their stats as things change politically. I mean, by that I mean they shrink. They have shrunk the stats based on those they don't count as unemployed anymore. In other words, if they've been out of the workforce long enough, they don't count them. So my question is, I'd like to have your perspective on a public works program, which I think with a wage that would keep the wolf away from the door, so to speak. As you can tell, I'm from the working class, and that's what I did most of my life as an industrial worker. And it was very striking to me in this sharp recession in 2008 to 2014, which, by the way, when the economists said the recession was over, when you go and talk to workers, they weren't part of the recovery, a lot of the working class. So on a public works program, which happened in the 30s, could you comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, and I think this gentleman earlier talked about the itinerant workers and temporary workers and other work arrangements, and I think manufacturing plants and even the better places to work are to some extent busy reducing their wages. You certainly see that in the auto industry, where the new workers are at a very different wage than the legacy workers. And I would say experienced, existing workers. That's part of one of the ways they do it, or they just negotiated into the contract that the new workers would come in at a lower wage. You see that in the auto industry a lot. So that's happening out there, absolutely. It's tricky on the infrastructure and the public works program. So I've read some research or done some research that shows that, for example, our investment in the national highway system between the 1950s and 1973 was very productive for the economy, but then we had a national highway system. And so additional investments since then have been they've clearly been less beneficial for the economy, and it's not clear if it's as beneficial. So it absolutely could be true. It was a great idea what we did in the 1930s, but it doesn't necessarily mean it would have as much success now. So India would really benefit from, it doesn't do us any good, but India would really benefit from a huge public works project if they could afford it, because they have, woeful infrastructure in a lot of places. So I would say here, if we're going to do it, we have to be more careful than we've ever been to make sure we're only doing the most important projects, the ones that are most critical. And if we do that, and we are dedicated to that goal, and we have to tell people no, and we have to disappoint a lot of people, your project doesn't make the cut. If we did that, I think it could help the economy. We just have to be very disciplined, because it's going to be harder than to do it right now than back in the 1930s when we had far less infrastructure than we have now.
In an OLLI class I took approximately a year ago, and if Jerry Pitter's here, he can tell you who the group was, that do the statistics and compare them to other states, and they're out of UNO. And the question I had asked them is, how come if Nebraska's unemployment rate is going lower, why do we have more demand for food help? I would think those would coordinate. If there's more people employed, there should be less need for help with food. The answer they gave me was, the way this unemployment statistics work, they don't have a way of counting those people who are doing 2 and 3 jobs just to make the money to feed their family. Wouldn't that skew that 25% graphic if we were able to count the people per jobs?
But I did have a household income graphic as well, although it's just hard to get the 25th, 75th percentile data. I think that
And that would also impact the,
I think
not
Nebraska,
having full-time parents, both parents
Sure.
to help.
right, I mean, you could have two parents and nobody's around if they're working 4 jobs between them. I think that that's an issue. I guess where I would disagree, I think people have pointed out weaknesses with the unemployment rate as a measure. I'm more skeptical is that those weaknesses have grown. I think they're as big of weaknesses as they always were. So I think if we compare ourselves to 20 years ago, our 2.5% rate does roughly mean what it meant 20 years ago as well. But it does have problems with it. People who have gotten discouraged and dropped out of the labor force, that's a problem. That one probably is a little worse now. And you're right. I mean, there's no distinction between someone with 1 job and someone with 3 jobs. Although, anymore, a lot of the people with 1 job, it's not a 40-hour-a-week job anyway. And maybe it never was. It's a 60 or 70-hour-a-week job. And so maybe someone with 2 30-hour-a-week jobs, the hours are the same. Well, it's obviously better to have a full-time job. I agree. Yes?
Looping back again to the workplace history graph and so forth, I was wondering if it really is the definition that, I notice Lincoln's much higher than Omaha and so forth. Is it because we have a lot of students who graduate? They have no work. In other words, the history, are we talking about experience?
Well, we did ask that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that employers wouldn't think of it in both places.
Yeah,
the answer to the
what I'm
experience
saying
question.
is it a broader measure? The history, in my experience, in both looking at people to hire and being hired, is that it's the experience that counts. And if somebody goes in, has a great degree but has 0 experience, they worked at Runza, versus somebody that has 2 years experience, they're more likely to get hired at Firespring or someplace like that.
Or had the right internship when they were in school
Right.
rather than working.
And the other thing is, I was interested that there were 3 things. It had to do with
A background check?
background.
Was the other one?
Right. Is it because Lincoln's was, again, much higher?
Mhm.
Is it because we have local correctional institutions that have provided some of those people? I'm just curious.
I was puzzled why Lincoln was the highest one too. The explanation I gravitated to is the students. To the extent that the background check type issues vary over someone's lifetime, which I think they do for some people. When they were young, they had one way of rolling, and when they're older, a little bit different. So you could possibly explain that with the larger share of young people. But I can't say that's for sure reason. That's very receptive of your explanation.
Yes, a question relative to society's value that they place on different professions. And the issue of education has come up repeatedly this evening. And yet, teachers are some of the lowest paid employees in the state, especially in the rural areas. How does that impact what you're talking about?
Well, I think that's another cultural, societal thing. I think there's other societies that we compete with where, people in engineering and teaching and architecture benefit from more prestige relative to people in, finance and things like that than here in the United States.
Why does
So
society discount teachers?
I think, boy, that's a hard question. I think it is cultural. You'll find countries like Japan and Germany where I think they do hold teachers in relatively higher esteem, and I think some other occupations like engineers and so forth. Why? My personal opinion, I don't research this, is we as a society, have fallen into a habit of blaming the teachers for the characteristics of students that we don't like, even though many of those characteristics are more of a product of their parents. That's what I think.
I'm going to take prerogative of asking the last question. We just heard last week, I believe, that Finland is going to try a massive experiment to provide a minimum wage to 25% of their unemployed people as a big experiment. And we know they've already renovated their whole education system. They have the best one in the world by raising salaries, prestige, decentralizing decisions. What do you think about this income that they're going to try?
Well, they'll have 30% unemployed. No, that was a typical economist answer for your amusement. Well, again, I'm not super negative about higher minimum wages, but economists do worry that anytime you're sort of picking the price, there could be consequences. But, I think as a society, maybe we do want to have some idea of this is the minimum that people should get when they're working. I think if you're already at the finished minimum wage and you're talking about pushing it up further, maybe I feel more like an economist when I'm thinking about that. That you could take it too far.
They're talking about 10,000 in the U.S. as a base for everybody.
$10 an hour?
10,000 a year for no work.
Oh, our little nerdy term for that is reverse income tax. Yes, that would be an economist's design of an efficient way to redistribute income. Okay, that's why they don't let us be in charge. Yeah, I mean, that could help, maybe. I mean, in theory, it could help.
But the idea is that you get
Yeah.
10,000 if you didn't want to work, you didn't have to, if
Right.
you make it on 10,000.
This would be our method of redistributing income. And so, yes, now a big problem we have that's probably contributing to these things, and I'm sorry I didn't talk about it, is we have effective tax rates on low-wage workers, poor workers, which are incredibly high. Because you make a little more money, you lose this benefit from the public, you lose that benefit from the public. It's a huge problem. And that approach, and I'm sorry I'm getting punchy because I've been up here a long time, that approach might be a way to redistribute income without introducing that really high effective tax rate. So there could be some merit to it. I didn't mean to.
Yeah. Well, I just read about it. And I didn't.
Yeah, that would be the rationale. Should we be doing these bold changes before we kind of do the simple stuff that we know we can do that would hurt a little bit? Maybe we should do that first. And once we got that done, then we can try the innovative. That's sort of how my mind works at this point in time, at least.
Time is 9 o'clock. Please join me in thanking Dr. Thompson.
I thought you would ask the question, why did that curve go like this when the price of corn was going like this? Yeah, that's what the farm income is like about 80%. There might be a house. There's one that's going up in the second
And they both had a lot of coal, and when the price of coal would decline, it would just wreak havoc in Appalachia, and the folks out in western Kentucky, they would be all right. You know, and I think it was because some of that stuff you're talking about, they just were better able, for whatever reason, to deal with things.
It's a cultural thing.
Yes.
A deep, I mean, multi-generations back cultural thing.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, the latest research on Charlie Rose on the New Brain series talked about the fact that stress on a child 3 years and less becomes inheritable. It actually changes the genes that they pass on. I don't understand it, but it's incredible.
I don't know anything about it, but I heard about that too. And again, growing up in a more stressful environment for whatever reason, it just on the margins, it can affect you when you're older.
Well, one more question and then take a break.
Hi, I just finished reading the book called Viking Economics by George Lakey. And it's fascinating, and it shows how in Scandinavian countries, they do a much better job than the United States does in income distribution and wealth management. And in the higher income people in those countries are willing to pay 50% of their income in taxes so that the entire society can benefit, whereas in our country, all we're talking about is how we as individuals can benefit instead of how the society is going to benefit.
Yeah, that may play a role as well. Again, maybe struggling families don't have to struggle quite as much in that environment, and less stress and so forth. And actually, I was thinking, I'm not sure that's the way the Vikings would have done it. But the modern Scandinavians, that's what they do.
Before we take a break, I'd like to announce the next two topics because there was a change in the schedule. Next week we'll be making sense of the 2016 elections. I've been working on that too. Was it economic inequality? Then we have a substitute because one of our speakers could not come, as Dick said last week. But we will have Dr. Bridget Gooseby, who is from the Department of Sociology, UNL, who will talk about, oops, the topic is not here. The topic is not here. It will be a good one.
Is that one of those catchy titles, or does it literally mean the topic is not here? Oh, okay.
Race, gender, and inequality.
Race, gender, and inequality. So two great topics coming up. So let's thank Eric and then take a quick break.